So today we're going to talk about religion in prison. And we're going to try to address three different points, right? One of which is what are some of the factors that lead to somebody adopting a religious belief system while they're incarcerated? What are some of the experiences that somebody that is religious might have while they're incarcerated? And then and what are some of the factors that lead somebody to perhaps not continue with that faith or not be successful in that walk once they're released, right? And does that somehow show that they're disingenuous or not sincere in what they were doing in prison? So let's unpack this. First of all, at least in terms of my experience, the religions that I'm most used to seeing and hearing about people adopting in prison would be some form of Christianity, some form of Islam, or some form of indigenous belief systems, right? So there are other, obviously, religions and beliefs out there. And so this is not meant to prioritize one over the other or cast judgment on those of faith or who lack faith or whatever your cup of tea is. This is just religion in prison in general. And so what are some of the reasons that people adopt religion in prison? First, and perhaps the most deceiving, is as a shield, right? Perhaps they have charges that they don't want exposed to the normal scrutiny that happens when you arrive in prison or transferred to a different yard. Charges that could put them in danger or jeopardy. Maybe they've done something, right? They've been an informant, or they've otherwise betrayed a particular group, or just fell out of favor with them, perhaps through no fault of their own, just dirty politics. And so they think that by adopting religion and saying, hey, I'm not this, whatever race or whatever group, I'm a believer in this, that will, again, shield them from the scrutiny that group holds. Those people tend to still engage in the unhealthy behaviors they may have, right? They might still be getting loaded. They might still be hustling. They might still be involved in a variety of things that your average person would not see as consistent with somebody who's trying to practice, that faith. Other times it is you've been alienated from your group, right? Maybe you've been removed, or your group has otherwise kind of turned on you. You feel betrayed. And so that identity that you had in belonging to the group, you now sort of question, right? And so you start wondering kind of, what is my purpose and who am I? And maybe you're reflecting back on some religious upbringing that you had. In particular, in communities of color, very few grow up with no exposure to religion whatsoever, right? That doesn't mean everybody believes. That doesn't mean that the faith of your parents is going to be your faith or anything of that sort. But very few, again, in particular, people of color are entirely ignorant of the notion of God, right? In some form or fashion. And so maybe you're sitting there and you're reflecting back on that and just decide, hey, my life is going to take a different turn. So perhaps you were helped to get there by being alienated or removed from your group, but that doesn't necessarily make you walking in that faith less sincere. Most people that have a belief system, there's some kind of activating event that triggers it for them. And so there's also situations where your loved ones on the streets, right? Your old lady or your kids or your mom or somebody is in your ear. Maybe they've started going to church since you got incarcerated, or they've started going to the temple, or they've started engaging in what's commonly called like cultura cura practices, right? And so they're sharing that with you and encouraging you and kind of evangelizing and preaching, so to speak, to you to join them in that journey, right? And you see what's going on around you, and you're kind of led in that direction by your loved ones outside. And then other times it's just, a lack of hope, right? Or a frustration, or just sitting there like, man, what is going on, right? And how did this happen? And what is there in my life? People can be triggered by something they see on TV, or something that they read, or just being exposed to some kind of text, or observing others that are practicing and saying, man, that looks attractive, right? And that That's something I'd like to know more about. Maybe they have a celly that's into stuff. It varies by group segment, I think. That last part is something you would see less among those that identify as Northerners or Southerners or some branch of. I think that happens more in just like the broad general white population or the broad general black population, obviously with others and various indigenous belief systems. And so there's a range. People adopt religion or re-adopt religion for a number of reasons. Others come in, their arrest or their early part of their detention kind of causes them to step back and reevaluate what's going on. It's often said that people in their most desperate situations will call out for their mom or for God, right? And so some folks do that. One example would be Sir Dino, who people might know from the Darkroom Familia and all that stuff. He's now a pastor, right? David Roca. And so he had a come to Jesus moment, so to speak, fairly early in his incarceration, but he did not hide. He didn't go PC up. He didn't tell on anybody in that whole indictment, which was kind of surprising considering all of the supposed hardcore gangsters that did. He just took a different path and was actually pretty upfront about it, and that was respected. I think there's a number of reasons for that, some of them political, but that's not for this spiel. And so it happens in various ways and for various reasons. So what does that look like now, right? What does that look like for somebody who's incarcerated? Again, it varies on group segment. It also varies depending on what type of yard you're on, what level yard you're on. I've only been on level 3 yards, level 4 yards, and then in ADSEG and the SU program. So I can't speak from personal experience of level 1s and 2s, but my understanding is that's oftentimes more acceptable in the lower level yards. Now, when I was in Solano, which was a level 3, there was actually a group of Christians on the yard of mixed ethnicities and mixed geographic backgrounds, and they were pretty much left alone. Now, on our end, those who were from Northern California and were Latino, we still ran backgrounds on them. We still checked their paperwork. So they were not hiding. If they owed something or they were deserving of some consequence for past behavior, then they got that, whether they carried a Bible or not. Among the Muslim population there, a lot of them were affiliated with the Panthers in the past, affiliated with other groups. And so the Muslims would embrace anybody. Most of them were black, but not necessarily all of them. However, if you had a history of being affiliated with a group, if you were a Blood or a Crip or a Northerner or something, whatever, then they would need to make sure that you were being allowed to leave from that group before they embraced you. And the reason for that is they don't want problems, right? They're men of faith, and while they will get down and defend themselves in a heartbeat, they don't want to add issues to their faith community by embracing people who have issues with other groups, right? And so, and then, among a lot of the native folks, there was indigenous beliefs and they sort of did their thing, but they're all grouped together as others, and folks generally didn't pay too much attention to what they weren't doing. And so, and that's not to put them down or their beliefs down, it's just, they're not too much of a factor, at least in my experience, on most yards. And certainly their belief systems are not a factor to how people treat them. On the higher level yards, it's a little bit of a different story. I actually was a part of having somebody removed from Salinas Valley for identifying as a Christian. Now, it wasn't just that, and there was some other issues involved, but long story short, a guy came to the yard and he was identified by administration as a Northerner, and he had been incarcerated before and he had functioned as a Northerner. He had some tattoos, but he pulls up on our yard and he says, "Man, I'm a Christian." And so he moves into a cell, but it's a Northerner cell. And he's kind of preaching to his cellie, right? While you're listening to these dudes, you should ignore them. And so that was a bit of a red flag, no pun intended. And then there was an individual on our yard who owed some cleanup and was like, "Oh, I'll get him. I'll get him." I think it was actually kind of an act of cowardice on his part because he wanted to go after the low-hanging fruit. but I was frustrated with him, and I was frustrated with his presence on the yard. And so, unfortunately, I guess in hindsight, I said, go, fine, just go whack him. And he went and he cut him and gave him a little scratch and didn't even mess the guy up really, right? He went up to the CO and he had a towel on his neck. He sewed, there was some blood. They laid the yard down. That was it. The other thing was the way he was writing. And so the way he wrote when we asked him to answer some questions was in like a tagging style, in what people would call gang style. That's the way it was conveyed to me. And when I read it, it was not what I would have expected, A, from a Christian, and B, from a homeboy, right? That's not the style I would expect from a homeboy in writing what should be a professional response to some pretty standard questions. Which gets to the point of there's judgment, right? If you identify as a believer in something, you're gonna face some extra scrutiny. And it's odd because you face that scrutiny from people who don't necessarily subscribe to that same belief system. So I was looking at this dude saying, this is not Christian behavior, but yet I am not the one to identify what is or is not Christian behavior, right? I wasn't reading the Bible. I was a homeboy. And so it really wasn't my place to decide what is or isn't Christian for him. But in that moment, in that lifestyle that I was living at the time, that was a choice that I made. And I identify as a Christian now, right? I'm not into the colonial Christianity of the United States, but I'm into the biblical Jesus of Scripture. And that's for a whole nother conversation. And so the experiences vary. And if you're a part of a relatively organized group, in particular Northerners and Southerners, then there's really no passes on level 4 yards, not that I'm aware of, because it's a violent environment, it's a dangerous environment, and you don't fit into the pre-designed setup of prison, right? And you know, there's been other videos by other folks that have talked about this. I will talk about this at some point in the future, but to think that gangs, quote unquote, are solely responsible for organizing the structure of prison is not true. Administration has played a role in that historically, and there's a little bit of back and forth, right? Not cooperation in a treasonous sense, but mutual understanding. And so these gangs and groups run the yards, but the administration is well aware of and supports what is necessary for that to happen, right? So the separation of people, the segmenting of different folks in groups, you know, Latinos, for example, particularly those of Mexican descent, you go into prison, your only options are to be a Northern Hispanic or a Southern Hispanic or a Mexican national. And when you go in there and you're black or you're white, that's not true. You're just of that race. And then there's a footnote of what group segment you're a part of. And so just to show, right, like there's an interplay. And so in that interplay, there's no Christian identity. There's no Muslim identity. Now, the Muslim card is actually fairly deep in some places. And within the black population and the broader population, that is seen as a little different. I'm not exactly sure why. I think probably because within the Muslim population, there's an air of militancy oftentimes. They carry themselves with respect. They carry themselves with dignity. Their beliefs are actually kind of foreign to a lot of people that haven't been exposed to Islam. So people aren't even sure what they're supposed to do except not eat pork. And a lot of them are older folks who are unquestionably with the business. They've just chosen to take this different path. But they will organize and kick it off in a heartbeat. And if you put them in danger or you threaten them, they will get active with you. If there's a race riot, they will get active, right? So, which compared to Christians tend to want to back up, be more passive, not engage. Well, prison is not a passive environment, and passive people endanger other folks because you're a liability. So the religious experiences, again, in the general population, and things change now with the whole S and Y and mixing, that's not my experience. And so I would imagine that for the integrated yards, people call them 50-50, as I've said before in another video. I don't believe there's any such thing as a 50-50 yard, because if you go to that yard and you stay, then you are a part of the population, right? You are a part of the S and Y population, and which is fine if that's your business, but you you're not active, so to speak, right? You can't be both. So it's not 50-50 if it's fully integrated. So religious folks might fit a little bit easier there because that's sort of a space where anybody can basically do anything or be whatever they want. But in the traditional general populations, much less so. And I think that was different historically back in the days. I think picking up the Bible or picking up the Quran, you would get a pass. But with the rise of the prison population, with the expansion of prisons, with the real clear lines that were drawn between different group segments and gangs, that's no longer as acceptable. And so if you're in AdSeg, you're in the SU, you're wherever, then it's kind of your business because you're isolated anyways. And so now to the point of when you come home. So our jailhouse conversion is real. And on an individual basis, obviously, it's not for me to judge another person's faith walk or the sincerity of that or whatever. But I have known folks who said that they had adopted some faith while they were in there or returned to that faith. And then they come home and they're back using drugs within a short period of time. They're kind of back on the streets, engaged in unhealthy activities. They walk away from their studies. They don't plug into a faith community. And it's very easy for people to turn around and say, see, they were fake. See, they were never really with that, right? You were not a sincere believer in this, because if you were a sincere believer, you would not be out here doing these things. First of all, nobody is perfect, right? And so nobody of any faith system walks that out in perfection every day. Everybody stumbles sometimes. Everybody reverts back to old mindsets or old behaviors sometimes. Sometimes it's for a moment, sometimes it's for a whole season, sometimes it's for the rest of their life. But this idea that you need to, again, kind of be perfect and be a shining example, that's hard for anybody to live up to. And so I don't think that those jailhouse conversions or catching religion in prison, so to speak, is necessarily faulty just because they come home and don't continue in that walk. A lot of faith communities aren't particularly welcoming to people who come home, right? I got a bunch of tattoos. There's churches that I walk into and people clutch their purses a little bit tighter and people are distant and who is this guy? And then there's others that embrace me wholeheartedly. It all depends. And so if you're coming home and you don't have a welcoming community, it can be kind of hard to plug in. Also, in particular, if you develop your faith or grow your faith in some type of isolated environment and you're not in community on the yard, then it's just you and these religious texts, right? You and these lessons or whatever you have access to. But as I've said before in other videos, prison is a bubble. Living in prison is a bubble that applies in every conceivable way. And so that means your faith is also sort of being practiced in a bubble. And that doesn't make it easier or harder or less sincere or more sincere. It's just different. And practicing your faith in prison does not necessarily prepare you to practice it outside of prison. Religion in the streets has a whole lot of politics attached to it. And so if you're just reading a text, like for example, I read the Bible cover to cover, it's very difficult to find churches that preach the Jesus that I read about. And so that leaves me kind of disconnected. But I'm well versed in it, right? I'm pretty well versed in Islam and indigenous beliefs and Buddhism and that kind of stuff. It's just a subject that I'm interested in. But that makes me non-welcome because I don't subscribe to the fractioning out of groups, right? I don't subscribe to this idea of denominations. I don't describe to this talking out of both sides of your mouth or being lukewarm, right? And so I don't fit in a lot of America's religious circles of any religion, but because it was just me, right? And so for those of faith, you might see it as, man, it was just me and God time. And then you come out of prison and it's still you and God time, but it's also expected for it to be you and other people and you and God through other people, which people are fallible and people are weird, and so it doesn't always play out well. And that could lead people away. Sometimes it's the stress of coming home, right? You're in prison and you're like, hey, I'm this changed man and I'm forgiven, or I'm anointed, or I'm blessed, or I've returned to my roots, or whatever it may be. And that could very well be true. But then you come home and real life slaps you in the face, and it's hard, and the struggle is real. And so you get off track, right? Or you make concessions, or, your wife who was preaching to you and encouraged you to walk away from the homies and just accept God and do all this other stuff. Now you guys are split. You're not even together anymore. And so your faith goes down the tube along with your relationship. And people in society go through the same thing, right? That's the other point. There's a greater critique of those who are in really difficult circumstances and look to faith as a way to process that or help remove themselves from that and then slip later. When in reality, like I said, everybody slips sometimes. And there are often people who, because of job insecurity or relationship insecurity or fighting with their kids or having to relocate to another area, all those things can lead people to walk away from their faith or at least turn from it compared to how they were before. And so it's no surprise that coming from an entirely different world, which is prison, out to the streets can also have that same effect. Certainly, again, there are those who adopt it as a shield. They adopt it as a way to avoid accountability. And so they actually have no real intentions on walking out this faith. They just, frankly, in my book, are cowards. And so for those people, yeah, they're probably looking forward to going home and engaging in the same activity because that walk was not sincere. Others come home and they do find a way to keep it going. And maybe it looks a little bit different than what they had intended, or looks a little bit different than what other religious people may recognize, but it's no less sincere and it's no less valuable to them. And so there's a range. Like I said, I would not discount somebody who, like, oh, bro, you was praying in prison and now you're not praying out here, so you were fake in prison. It may be true, but I think every belief system also cautions folks against judging other people, and in particular, judging other people's faith walks. And that's kind of a universal across the board, because nobody knows the mind of the divine, if that's what you believe in. And so that's my take on religion in prison. I'd encourage you guys to look back at some of my other videos. And yeah, remember to help others move in excellence. That's what a homie is, and that's what the movement is about.